super excited to have Kaya Henderson with us today on Outspoken. I got to know Kaya Henderson in her current role, which is as the CEO of Reconstruction, a technology company which delivers K-12 supplemental curriculum that situates Black people, culture, and contributions in an authentic and identity-affirming way. This allows students of all backgrounds to benefit from a more complete understanding of our shared history and society. Outschool.org has had the privilege of using Reconstruction with our community partners across the country and gotten to see the impact firsthand as kids light up in the face of their classes. Kaya is also the co-host of the very popular pod Save the People, and she also leads Kaya Henderson Consulting. Kaya was also extremely influential as the Chancellor of DC Public Schools from 2010 to 2016. Thanks to Kaya's leadership, students had the greatest growth of any urban district under the National Assessment of Education Progress over multiple years. And the district improved by a myriad of other measures, including increased enrollment, graduation rates, participation, and pass rates for advanced placement, student satisfaction, and teacher retention. Kaya began her education career as a middle school teacher in the South Bronx through Teach for America. She also worked for Teach for America in multiple roles, including as the DC Executive Director and as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at the New Teacher Project.
Well, I'd love to kick us off with a question that we love asking on this podcast, being the Outspoken podcast, which is, what are you most outspoken about in education? What is it that you wish everyone working in this space would understand?
I think this has changed over time, but most recently, I am super outspoken about the way we do our work. And I believe that it has to be done in collaboration with the community. I think that for far too long, especially when I think about the last 30 years of education reform in the United States, we've done things to communities. We've substituted our judgment for community's judgment. And what I found is, the people closest to the problem usually have the best solutions, right? They might not have access, they might not have power, they might not have agency, they might not have resources. When those of us who have those things partner with and really co-create, I don't mean inform, I don't mean suggest, I mean literally we have to put our power dynamics aside and really partner with communities. And I want to specifically call out young people, right? Like, we talk about what we're all of the things that we're going to do for young people, and we often don't ask young people what they need. We underestimate their ability to lead. And, I could tell you stories on stories on stories about times where the adults had one set of ideas, and I was like, let's just talk to the young people. And the young people had a better set of ideas, a more effective, more sustainable set of ideas. And so I think if we're serious about making real educational change, and the places that I've seen real transformation happen in education, it has always involved partnership and co-creation with the community, and it has always involved youth voice. Like, I am unapologetically outspoken about that.
I absolutely love that. Sometimes reflect on, as adults, we have experience that can be valuable, but we don't see with the clear eyes that kids do, as we're seeing through all the filters that our experience has provided. And I wonder what we could unleash in terms of human potential if we could, really empower kids. So I absolutely love that.
Our filters don't even work anymore, right? Because our filters were for a different time.
Right.
We're for a different game. Like, the rules of the game have changed. Like, the strategies have changed, and we are substituting our many times outdated judgment onto a new scenario.
Yeah, 100%. I have this aspiration, which I'll voice here, and this is a long-term project, but, I'd love to see youth voices in the Outschool boardroom. I think it's challenging on all kinds of levels, but, to me, that'd be the ultimate about putting young voices in positions of power with access to power and what happens when we do that. But it's challenging, people, go into the boardroom and they're at the pinnacle of their career, and to then have be sat
but
side by
you
side
start
with
with
voices. It's
you
difficult.
start with an advisory board, a youth advisory board that is given, and you have to train young people up to be able to sit in a room with these established people. But, when I was at DC Public Schools, we had a student cabinet. I also had a parent cabinet. I had a teacher cabinet. And, I to all three about the same set of issues and ideas. I brought the same problems to them, scaffolded for how they interacted. And they all had good ideas that I could then bring back to the leadership team or to the broader community. And so I think that we have to start, I hate the token, like we'll put one student on the thing and, that's not a recipe for success. But I do think that, there may be a particular time where your board and the advisory group meet, right? And so, and can discuss things that they've both been prepared for. But I think that we've got to start putting young people, like we say to young people, we're preparing you to lead 20 years from now. Leadership is like driving, like you learn it as you do it. And so let's give them opportunities to lead so that they are prepared to lead when they have the moment.
Love it. And we should have an outschool learner advisory board, learner community folks. Fernando, I'm talking to you. If you're listening in, we should already have talked about this. So thank you for that wisdom and for what you're outspoken on.
I'm really curious. Amir mentioned this concept of power, right? And I think, you work in Black communities all across the country. And I think historically in the US, right, we have seen very active attempts to keep power away from Black communities and keep the ability for Black communities to self-organize as something that's not possible, right, and not tenable, or something that's really difficult to do. And I'm just curious, given your work to organize the voice of communities and to give communities voice and agency, particularly around education, just what you're seeing in the landscape, right, as you kind of talk to communities across the country, and what's standing in the way of us giving communities more power and more of the ability to really implement the solutions that are going to be best for them.
It's a good question, Justin. I think I have two completely different answers. So pardon me for being schizophrenic for a minute. On the one hand, I think that communities are exercising their power every single day. There are things happening, small things that are happening in communities where the community will actually get together and take care of one another or advocate for one another or lobby, for things that they need in their communities. And I think that is happening. We think about great big things, right? And in lots of great big things, communities don't have even the language sometimes or the training to be able to engage in discussion or in decision making around what's happening in their community. Why do I think that is? One, I think, historical power dynamic. That power, nobody wants to give their power away. Everybody wants to retain power. It's a very sexy thing. And I think that, with the history of racism and segregation and marginalization in this country, that's one of the main reasons why we're not really interested in giving Black communities power or empowering them in the same way that we are willing to empower some other communities. I also think that we severely underestimate communities because many of these communities face issues like housing insecurity or food insecurity or environmental problems. We assume that these communities are broken. We think about these communities from a deficit perspective. And we believe that if these communities could do better, they would do better. Well, the truth of the matter is there have been systematic policies and, historical occurrences and whatnot that are the reason why, these communities are problematic and are not facing so many challenges. And so I think we assume that people in Black communities, especially low-income Black communities and other communities of color, low-income communities, period, I think we're starting to see the vilification of poor white communities as well. And we basically say those people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And and they don't deserve power. And I think that none of that is true. I think you have to be able to zoom back. One, being a student of history is really important because people will give you a narrative today about what is today without you having a clear understanding of how this stuff got this way, right? And this is part of what we do at Reconstruction. It is important for young people to know their history, our history in this country, so that then you can figure out how to solve the problems of your own community. You can figure out what power you do have and how you can organize that to make bigger change. But I think that, if we're really honest, we're not interested in giving marginalized communities power.
That's so interesting. And it makes me think about the word meritocracy.
Where's one of the, where is that at? Because I'd like to go there. I'm a hard worker. I do good. Like,
let's talk about fake meritocracy, because that is where I think we are today because of this failure to acknowledge or address systemic issues and issues rooted in history. And yet, there's a narrative of meritocracy, which I think is damaging. And at the same time, aspirationally, wouldn't it be great if we could live in that world? And so I guess, how do you play with those ideas? How do we address the fact that we don't live in meritocracy, but there's this narrative that we do, and that's stopping people addressing some of the systemic issues? And it's also something to aspire for. How do we untangle all of that?
I think a meritocracy is absolutely aspirational. And in the same way that, owning a home is the American dream, the reality is not everybody owns a home, right? It is something that we all strive for. It is galvanizing around, it galvanizes us to act in a way that is fiscally responsible. And so I think that the idea of meritocracy is one that is useful for galvanizing action, right? For pointing people in a particular direction and getting people to do the thing that, we are aspiring to do. And at the same time, the reality is, there's no way this could be a meritocracy when certain groups have had advantages from the beginning and continue to have advantages, and other groups have never had advantages, and even small attempts to create some parity, not even real parity, but just a little bit of leg up, ends up creating real divisiveness in our country. It pits citizen against citizen and community against community. And so I don't think if there was an easy answer, we would have figured it out by now. But I think part of what is really important, and I think this is why we're in the midst of culture wars, is we have to be really honest about why we can't have a meritocracy, right? And honesty requires a real examination and analysis of history. It requires an acknowledgement of privilege. Nope, you don't own slaves. You didn't own slaves, but your great-grandparents did, and that advantaged you in ways that my great-grandparents could not advantage me, right? We have to be really honest about that. And we have to together talk about what the path forward is, right? The thing that most dismays me at this point is that we are retreating into our disparate camps. I only need to be with people who look like me and who come from the same place as I am because we need to hold on to our power. That's just not how you accomplish great things. I don't know how we could be a great country if we're all in our respective corners, right? The best of the United States is a whole bunch of people from a whole lot of places coming together, believing in something together and working together towards that. And somehow or another, not somehow or another, I am very clear that the way that you unravel that is to make people think that somebody is trying to take their piece of the pie. And that narrative has been incredibly effective over the last, how many ever years. It is influencing what we're teaching in our schools. It's influencing, people's access to information. It is influencing all kinds of things that I think make our country less competitive, make our country unsafe. The level of violence and civil disobedience, right? Like it really is disturbing. And so I think we need ideals, shared ideals to aspire to together. We need opportunities to work together to get to those ideals. And we used to do that. And somehow or another, I think we have to find our way back to that, whether it is meritocracy or whether it is, I mean, it's even as basic as seeing the humanity in other people. The way we are able to other each other and communities is because we don't see people as people. We don't see people as deserving of the same things that we have, healthcare and food and shelter and things like that. This is really basic. I travel all over the world, and most other governments at least want to guarantee people some level of human stability, for lack of a better term. And we're like, go for it, friends. I hope it works out for you. And I just don't think that that's the way, we are great.
Yeah.
I have one follow-on question, and then I'll ask Justin to get us back on track. Have you ever considered running for office?
No.
Please?
Not interested. Oh my gosh. That would
was awesome.
suck my soul.
Oh, okay. You dashed my hopes, but okay, let's get back on track.
I don't know. You're still a young Kaya. There's time for us to try to convince you. Yeah.
Not that young, I promise.
I mean, compared to the folks we got, doing pretty good. You're the youth advisory board. It's wild. No, I mean, I think, this, I'll try to get us back on track, but I think that even this idea of a meritocracy, right? It comes from this idea that merit is external or something that you work towards rather than it is something that intrinsic, right? We are all full of merit, right?
Yes.
Because we are human.
Come on, Justin. Come on, Justin.
And so give me a meritocracy, but that is a society where we are humanists and we, similar to what you said, Kaya, just care about people and believe in the best in people and give them what they need to thrive, regardless of if they've toiled and worked and labored for 80 hours a week to get there.
Yeah.
So TBD. But, Kaya, you mentioned that these struggles for power, right, even make their way into the classroom. And, given what you do at Reconstruction and given your work, I'm just curious as to how that shows up in the work that you do, right? And the why, the vision and the mission behind Reconstruction, and what you've seen in the way of actually allowing learners to center their own experience as Black individuals in their own education and in the classroom.
It's a good question. So, for those people who don't know, at Reconstruction, we teach African American history and culture, centering off the African American experience, African American history, African culture. And we do this basically so that we can build really strong children, so that, as Frederick Douglass admonishes us, we don't have to repair broken men. If you think about our friends in the Jewish community, they don't wait for school to teach them teach their children their history and their culture, right? They actually teach it in Hebrew school or Sunday school. Think about our friends in the Chinese community who send their kids to Chinese school on Saturdays. In fact, in the African American community, we have historical precedents where freedom schools or citizenship schools, where we taught our own history and our own culture. And what I believe is, when you know who you are, you can engage with other people who also know who they are. You have respect for yourself and you have respect for other people. And if everybody else knows who they are and knows their history and their culture, and African Americans don't, it puts us at a significant disadvantage. There's also significant research which shows that when young people see themselves there and their community reflected in what they learn, that academic progress happens much more quickly, that young people are engaged in what they're learning, that they feel a sense of belonging, that they feel agency and leadership. And that has been my experience as an educator over the last 32 years. In fact, a lot of the work that we did at DCPS around curriculum, we required the inclusion of the histories and cultures of students that we served and the communities that we served. And we watched young people attach to their learning in ways that they hadn't attached before. We watched young people willing to wrestle with deep problems because they were we were asking them to solve problems for their own communities, things that they recognized were issues, and they wanted to jump in on that. And so that I could only do so much of it in a school day and in a school year. And I thought, what would it look like if I could, outside of school, really give, especially African-American young people and anybody who is interested in African-American history, because African-American history is American history, that we all need to know. Could I create, the kind of content that would lift up and affirm the African-American experience? And so that's what we do at Reconstruction. And what we find, we go out of our way to make our classes not feel like school, because so many of our young people have traumatic experiences in school. We try to create a space of belonging. We want you to feel like you're hanging out with your buddies and your cool auntie or your cool uncle, like not your mom or your dad, but like your cool auntie and your cool uncle who's teaching you some stuff and, maybe telling you some things that your mom and dad wouldn't. And that's the kind of space that we try to create for our young people. And we see them let down their guard. They want to be kids. They want to engage. We try to make our classes fun. There's lots of noise and laughter and, nonconformity. And, we seek kids who in school will not engage, but in Reconstruction classes will absolutely engage, will raise their hand, will take on leadership roles. We see young people who are progressing more in terms of their academics because they take Reconstruction classes. The best thing is that, we see kids who want to take more and more classes and families who want to engage more and more, school districts that want more and more of the content that we create. So I feel really good about the work that we're doing. I think that it's an important niche, and we're using technology to deliver this so that we can scale and get to as many kids as possible. And we've gotten a really positive response. So I think we're on the right track.
There was this moment in time, a small window, right, in 2020, where it seemed like there was going to be a new conversation around race and society and just the conversation we need to have as a people to move us forward. Seems that window pretty quickly closed and turned the other way, and then opened itself to a lot of conversations around critical race theory in the classroom and a lot of anti-diversity initiatives that we see happening now, directly targeted at education of all places. And you're on the front lines of this, I assume, in a lot of ways. And I'm just really curious as to how this kind of shift in national climate and conversation from a policy and political perspective have shifted the work that you do, the kids and families and communities that you serve, and just what your experience of that has been.
In 2020, we started Reconstruction right before the pandemic hit. And we wondered, would there be enough demand for this kind of learning? We wondered, would kids get on Zoom and take a class? We wondered a lot. And then the window opened in 2020, as you said, Justin. But there were a couple of important considerations that we made from jump that I think have positioned us to withstand the culture wars that we find ourselves in. I was a superintendent before this, and what I know about schools and school districts, and mostly school boards, is that not everybody thinks that African American history and culture is important. And so when we first said we're going to do Reconstruction, we're going to teach African American history and culture, so many people said to us, this has to be part of the core academic environment. This has to be what kids learn in school every day. And I said, no way. It has to be supplemental. It has to be in after school and summer school and electives and enrichment because the school board will fight about whether or not we should be in the core, and nobody will care what happens in the supplemental space, primarily because the supplemental space is voluntary, right? I'm not forcing anybody to learn what they don't want to learn. I am going with the coalition of the willing. There are so many people who actually want this history and culture. Why would I spend my time fighting people who don't? That's silly, right? And so we took the glide path of positioning ourselves in the supplemental space. And so there are absolutely places where, we cannot work in schools like Florida, right, because of their laws. But the other big decision that we made was that schools are not the only place where you find children. And so we wanted to make our product one that you could use in churches, you could use in, Boys and Girls Clubs or YMCAs or Girl Scout troops or Boy Scout troops or whatever, that we are actually flexible enough that we can be used outside of school. And so in places like Florida, we are working with churches who are trying to figure out how to teach African American history and culture in their Sunday school, and they don't have curriculum. And so they call us and say, how can Reconstruction help us? And we are there to support them in that way. We can license our curriculum to them so that they can teach it. We can professionally develop their teachers so that they understand how to create the space that we create. We can actually teach classes in Sunday school because we have that flexibility. And so I think we made some really strategic choices in the beginning that, so that have, shielded us in some respects. The other thing that is happening is there are people who never thought that we would be having this conversation. They always thought that kids would have access to diverse narratives and diverse history. And those people are like, oh my gosh, I want to live in a diverse and pluralistic society. I want my kids to understand African American history and culture. So thank goodness that even if they're not getting it at school, we can come and get it at Reconstruct.
That's awesome. I was going to ask you about supplemental education and the role it plays, but you answered that beautifully in terms of the advantages that Reconstruction has found. I'll just reflect that so many of those advantages of supplemental education have driven my thinking about OutSchool. But it's almost like if you start with something where the stakes are lower, actually you can find greater success in terms
Absolutely.
of helping kids. And you don't have to outschool only through schools and only through kind of core curriculums.
Yep. I also think that we are finally having a more expansive conversation around what success looks like for kids, right? And success is not just math proficiency and reading proficiency. When I asked, at some point I asked somebody on my team, we were saving money from consolidating schools. And I said, okay, what are we going to do with this money? And one of my esteemed team members said, we're going to double block reading and double block math at the elementary school. And I said, at the time I had a first grader in my house, and I said, he can't sit through a block of reading or a block of math. How is he going to sit through a double block of anything? Is that what you want for your kid? And my colleague said, oh, no. For my kid, I want them to play an instrument. I want them to speak a foreign language. I want them to excel at a sport. I want them to be technologically literate. And I was like, wait, you didn't say a word about math or English. And they were, of course, that is the low level. But if I'm going to have a fully realized child, I want them to do all of those things. And so I said, well, then that is what we will do with this money. And so we took that money and we required that elementary school kids have art, music, PE, foreign language, and computers every week as part of the elementary school curriculum. I say that to say supplemental, we put a lot of those things in the supplemental space. I think that we are now going to shift and start talking about a broader group of competencies that we want our young people to have, that heretofore the supplemental providers are the only ones who can actually do that. I think a lot about, the mental health crisis that we find ourselves in with our young people. I think about chronic absenteeism and a lack of engagement. And as supplemental providers, who are the people who can solve those problems, I think about how during the pandemic, when schools utterly failed to even open their doors, the nonprofit sector, the out of school time sector, the supplemental providers stood up and provided resources for kids, places for kids to go, alleviated the strain on parents. And so, and as soon as we got back to ourselves, we're like, okay, great, go back outside, go back where you belong. And I actually think, we have to have a different conversation about how much value supplemental providers or out-of-school providers or non-core providers contribute to what we want for our young people in our country.
100%. And I guess I'll inject a note of hope here. I don't think things have quite gone back to the way they were. I see a much greater understanding amongst families and policymakers about alternatives. And we're seeing that in a variety of programs, ESA programs, the microschool movements. I think the pandemic was a moment in time, but we are yet to reach the tipping point in the conversation about education, and we will. That is my
fair.
bet. I think we'll get there. And on the note, and I don't think we're alone in this. I speak to others, and there's leaders in various parts of education are also seeking to change the conversation in this way to have a broader view of what education is and a future-looking view of what education could be. And on that note, can you share a couple of education change makers that you admire and that you would want listeners to know about?
Let's see. Okay. One of my heroes, she is no longer with us. But I think she changed the game for the way I think about education, was a woman named Marva Collins. Marva Collins was a Chicago public school teacher who was deeply dissatisfied with what Black kids were learning in her community. And she opened a school in her kitchen called Westside Preparatory Academy. And she taught legions upon legions of young people. And her philosophy was really around high expectations, academic rigor, an expansive curriculum. And I think there are so many times where we think about systems as being intractable. And if the Chicago public school system is not a big intractable system, I don't know what is. But I think what she demonstrates for me is the ability for even one person to change a set of circumstances for themselves and for young people. And so not a lot of people know the Marva Collins story. When I was little, there was a documentary on her that I saw, and I've, she has a book and whatnot, but I think people should know about Marva because she provides a sense of possibility for what can be. I think about a couple of contemporary people I want to shout out. Speaking of Chicago, Jean-Claude Brizard, who is the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools. He leads an organization called Digital Promise, and Digital Promise is doing some really important work across the country around technology in schools. One of the biggest questions of the moment in education is, what do we do about AI? What's AI's role in education? What should we be guarding against? What world are we trying to prepare our young people for? And Jean-Claude is bringing together stakeholders, practitioners, policymakers, tech folks, corporate folks to work together to figure that out. And I think lots of times, like, we know people when they were the superintendent, and then we don't know what people go on to do. And this brother is leading some really important work that is going to help create a blueprint for how we think about technology in schools. The one other person who I'm like super hot about right now is a woman named Lacey Robinson, who runs Unbound Ed. I think perhaps one of the most important challenges that we face as a sector is how we professionally develop our teachers, how we grow and support teachers to do the work that we're asking them to do. We're seeing tremendous teacher burnout, teacher turnover, teacher shortage, in part because we ask teachers to do things that we have not equipped them to do. And Lacey and her team at Unbound Ed are killing the game on teacher professional development. They treat teachers with a tremendous amount of respect. They um, support teachers' growth and development from an equity perspective. And I just think that they're doing awesome work that teacher professional development doesn't show up on anybody's newspaper article or in anybody's blog post or whatever. It is the hard work that like has to be done if our schools are going to be successful. And I feel like Lacey and Unbounded are doing a yeoman's job. And so I'll shout them out.
You mentioned kind of the what Jean-Claude is doing at Digital Promise around AI. And I think I'd be remiss to not ask you kind of what are your kind of thoughts and thinking around both the promises and pitfalls of AI in education? I think particularly, we know that a lot of technology, which has been billed as transformational and innovative, have oftentimes gone to actually create more divides within our kind of communities and societies, which is why the work that Jean-Claude does is so important. But I'm just curious as to what is your kind of perspectives on AI currently, and how are you all thinking about that at Reconstruction as well?
I think that I think AI is here. It has been here. It didn't just get here. I think we're seeing some different manifestations and different access to the tools, the technological tools that will change a lot of how we live and work. And I think that we can't put our heads in the sand on this. I feel like we have to lean in. And again, I'll go back to this word, co-create. I think there are a lot of communities, usually when there's a new technology or a new thing, marginalized communities get left behind. These new tools are not designed for marginalized communities. And we spend decades thereafter trying to catch up. And I think there is an opportunity right now for the tech world and communities to come together and begin to co-create some of this technology as it continues to develop. And I think that it's important because, I said it earlier, like our kids live in a different world than we live in. And if we are going to prepare them to be successful in that world, we have to lean in. Communities of color are rationally distrustful of technology because things like algorithms are biased against us, because many of these tools have continued to disadvantage us or have expanded and the disadvantage. And I think if we pull away, only more of that will happen. And so we have to lean in. We have to demand a seat at the table. We have to co-create. I am not the most tech savvy person in the whole wide world. I'm not an early adopter of anything, but as I looked out and saw some of the capabilities of AI, I said to my team at Reconstruction, we have to figure out how to lean in here and how to, one, harness the power of this technology to help us do our jobs better. And two, we are a trusted brand. And so if we are using AI to power our work, perhaps the principals, the families, the district and charter organizations that we work with will feel like, okay, if Reconstruction is doing it, maybe it is not so bad. And that's what we're experiencing. We have developed a tool called Onyx, which helps teachers create curriculum that is informed by and infused with African-American history and culture. So you can literally kind of order up whatever you're teaching and decide that you want to infuse it with the Harlem Renaissance or the pyramids at Giza or Wilma Rudolph or inventors or, foods or whatever. And Onyx will provide you with resources to supplement your core curriculum that are discussion questions or math tasks or quiz examples or, activities that you can use in your classroom. And so we are putting that power in the hands of teachers so that they can create their own culturally responsive lesson. And, what our teachers are saying to us is, wow. In fact, my team was like, no, we're not messing with the AI stuff. It's like, yes, we are. And it took it took a little bit to get, our team engaged and moving, but I think it's really, really important for people like us to lean in. And so we're leaning in. We are also making sure that we are in professional learning communities where we see what's coming around the corner and we can begin to think about how we might help our communities embrace the change that is coming. But I do think, if I had one ask, I do think that the tech race is so capitalistically driven. And I actually think that there's going to be lots of money to be made for sure. But in every other sector, when we factor in diversity and inclusion, we always get better outcomes. So I want the tech bros to slow down for a minute, bring the community into the co-creation, and I guarantee you that the returns will be greater in the end. And so I think we need to shake our networks up a little bit and create more opportunities for that kind of collaboration. Tech bros and gals.
Tech folks, yeah. Oh, I hope they're
tech peeps.
Yeah, tech peeps. Yeah. No, and I think, I'm happy to hear that, like, what you all are working on at Onyx, because I think, to your point around the capitalistic race, right? So often a lot of these solutions or innovations go to where people see money because that's where there's value, right? So that's where they will then be able to make money to justify the billions of dollars that they are supposedly worth. And in doing so, they turn a blind eye to communities that they don't see as organized or as valuable, right, from a dollars and cents perspective, because they're not spending the money in the way that some other folks are. So I think the work that you all are doing to show how AI as a tool can be applied in communities of color and not only but with and in development and collaboration with them is really important to show examples of what it can and should look like. You made an ask to the tech peeps. Just thinking to another question that we really like to ask on Outspoken is just what do you ask of our listeners, right? Like, what do you think are the one or two things that our listeners can do to make change happen in education?
So I think the main thing that I would ask, you could be a parent, you could be a teacher, you could be a foundation or whoever. I think the main thing is that we have to engage. I think too often we just kind of expect that schools are going to work the way they have worked. Small note, they haven't worked writ large for a long time, but we just expect that they will work. And so, I think you have to engage in education as a partner. If you are, if you're a parent, you can engage in your student's class or in their school. I think you can anybody can engage with school districts. They always are asking for community feedback and input. And, oftentimes people just don't show up, and you have no idea how much power you could be exercising if you just showed up at these meetings and started to say what you want. I think our engagement in politics is really important. It's showing up at school board meetings. We watched a small fringe group, frankly, the Moms of Liberty, show up at school board meetings all across the country and tip the scales on what we are learning and doing. And I think that there are lots of communities that it doesn't even take a lot to show up. But I think that there's a way to exercise power, but you have to be engaged. I think you have to participate. You have to ask questions. You have to contribute. You have to make demands. Somebody once told me DCPS is never going to change unless parents are out in the street demanding something different. And I think that that's right. And I think that parents and community members often underestimate how much they can push change. The other thing that I would say is I think people have to advocate for the children in their lives, whether they are their children, their grandchildren, their nieces, their nephews, the children in their communities. All the adults have representatives and advocates, and children often don't. And so whether it is, what you think should be happening in school or the kinds of resources that you need in your community. We're having a conversation in our community about youth violence. Juvenile violence is pretty high rate in Washington, D.C. And we're having conversations about punishing young people instead of having conversations about engaging young people. And when the community rises up and says, don't give me a bill about, putting kids in jail, give me a bill about more resources to the Department of Parks and Rec and more resources to make schools engaging and things like that, I think we can get to some better solutions. The one other thing that I would say that people can do, this is something that I feel in my soul right this second, be nice to teachers. Like, we have a crisis in our country where, we've just gotten through a pandemic and teachers are like the only people in the world whose lives are not measurably different. Like, even healthcare, like, we've gone to split shifts and we've rethought to prevent burnout. But teachers, many of them went to school during the pandemic, held it down for the country during the pandemic, and they don't work from home. They don't have flexibility. And all of society's problems show up in school, and we're not resourced to deal with the mental health crisis or deal with all of these things. And we have taken this moment to, be mean to teachers, to hold teachers responsible for all of this societal stuff. And I think that the narrative on teachers right now is so dangerous because it has generational implications. Not just that people right now don't want to be teachers and are leaving the profession. Our young people are listening to this and saying, I want to do anything but. How are we going to continue to have an educated and informed citizenry if we've made the job of teaching so villainous that people don't want to do it, and that the only people who do want to do it are people who can't get other jobs? I think it is a divestment, a disinvestment in our country to continue with this narrative about teachers. And so I think it's important for everybody can be nice to a teacher. So I think it's important to be nice to teachers.
Hi, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you so much for the work that you do out in the world and for sharing some of your wisdom and light with us today.
Thank you for having me. And I'm super excited to support Outspoken and to support OutSchool. You've been an amazing partner to us, and I look forward to us continuing this work together.
Likewise, so excited by our continued partnership and so inspired by what you've shared today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation half as much as Amir and I did. I recommend checking out Kaya's podcast, Pod Save the People, and also checking out Reconstruction. Everything referenced today in the show you can find in our show notes and on our website.